Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, I guess, in some parts of the world. Hey, Dave, how you doing?
All right. How are you?
Doing good. I'm pretty good. It's November 11th. My name's Jamie, Grammy Banjo Company, and with me is my gorgeous, talented, expert co-host, Mr. David Banjowski.
Wow.
I know.
Gorgeous,
it's about as nice as I've ever been to you, I'm aware, but thank you as always. Also, thank you everybody who joined us last week. That was a ton of fun. For those of you that missed it, we did an Ask Us Anything session just with me, Jamie Deering, and Chad Kapotic. We're going to do those again because we didn't even come close to answering all of your amazing questions. So thank you everybody who tuned in for that. And we also solved that pesky technical issue at the end there. So future events will be far more straightforward. Right. Let's get to it, Dave. What do you say?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, very good. So this week, as you already know, we're very excited to feature bluegrass banjoist Mike Munford. Mike is a past IBMA Player of the Year winner and currently plays with the Grammy Nominated band Frank Solivan and Dirty Kitchen. Besides being one of the top banjoists on the scene today, as many of you will know, Mike is also a very highly rated banjo setup technician. So we've got lots to talk about today. Let's bring him in, Jonathan. It's Mr. Mike Munford, everybody. And we think he's there. He's not. He is whirring away. That's okay. He's coming back in.
He'll be right back. There he is.
There he is. Hey, Mike.
There we are.
How are you?
I can hear you now.
Awesome.
There we go. Absolutely. So we're going to get things kickstarted. Would you mind playing us a little tune off the top here? And then,
I'd like to. I'm going to warm up with a quick little bit of some Earl Scruggs, because I was just listening the other day to an old, something from the 50s, early 50s, live radio broadcast, and it's one of my favorite tunes to warm up on, and then I'm going to play you a tune. A little bit of
Awesome.
Get in Line, Brother.
Wow, Mike, that was fantastic.
Katie Hill.
Yeah. Lots of melodic playing right there.
That is a lot of melodic playing. Yeah, some sort of mid-position melodic and sort of down the neck melodic. It's kind of a little bit of guitar technique, a little bit down in this zone here too.
Okay, yeah. I remember learning Bill Keith version of Katie Hill out of a book years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bobby Thompson too, I think, had a recording of that back in the
Yes.
area code 615 days. Yeah.
Right.
We probably learned out of
Well,
the same book, that melodic banjo book from
yep.
Tristan.
That's it.
Right?
That's the one. I still have
Yeah.
that little like square 45 that came in that book. That the pull out 45.
Yeah. Man, I should have trimmed that square back. It was a lot easier.
Well, thanks for doing this. It's great to have you on the
to.
show.
Yeah, it's good to be part of it.
Tell us for people that aren't familiar with your background. How'd you get started with the banjo? Where'd you grow up when you first picked up the banjo?
From Baltimore, Maryland. Grew up, born actually in St. Louis, raised in Baltimore. When I was in my mid-teens, about 15, is when I first became aware of bluegrass. I'd probably heard it on the radio from time to time, not knowing what it was, just assuming it was country music of some kind. But a neighborhood friend of mine up the street had just gotten a banjo. And we didn't really have a neighborhood full of musicians. I mean, people would have pianos and things like that in the house, mostly for decoration, it seems like. But he had a banjo, and he showed it to me one day, and he started playing a little bit of Foggy Mountain Breakdown. And I didn't know the title of the tune, but I'd heard that tune on the radio or maybe at a ball game or something like that. And I always liked it, but didn't know what it was or how to seek it out. But here's a guy right in the neighborhood playing a little bit of it. And he was just learning too, but he could actually play that. And I said, "What is that? You got to show me who is this?" And he said, "Earl Scruggs, the guy who did the Beverly Hillbillies theme," which I also liked and enjoyed as a kid, but never enough to really pursue it. But it did catch my attention. It kind of fascinated me, just the sound of the instrument. But I didn't really go after it until I saw somebody right in front of me playing. And Foggy Mountain was the tune, and then he put on a record of Earl Scruggs live at Kansas State, and Earl Scruggs Review, and I wasn't really familiar with the band or anything like that, but the name Earl Scruggs was somewhat familiar, and he played the cut of Foggy Mountain Breakdown, and I was hooked right on the spot. I said, "You've got to show me how to do this. Even if I only learn this one tune, I just want to be able to do that." So it got me right between the ears. Sign me up.
Yeah, it's such for bluegrass players of bluegrass banjo, especially players, from when the time you were coming of age at that time. It's such a common kind of story. So where we've heard that the Earl Scruggs playing, it just captivated you. What do you think it was in his playing that comes across in that spoke to you and speaks to so many players like that, and you aren't even really know anything about the music, but it just kind of
Yeah, because I didn't really
out.
have a cultural connection to it. Really, didn't hear it other than hearing it on the radio or TV once in a while. I think what really got me was what seemed like such complexity, and sure enough, there is complexity in it. And I hadn't heard an instrument play that sounded like that. You hear violin, you hear a piano, of course there's plenty of complex music there, but you're hearing melodic lines and and later I learned to understand chords and all that kind of thing too. But with the banjo, it's just a completely different animal to hear. This series of notes, and at the time I didn't pick up on that these were built out of patterns. They just seemed like almost arbitrary notes flying in all over the place, and out of that tapestry of notes you hear a melody of some kind that emerges. In Foggy Mountain Breakdown, it was just the sheer energy, the rhythmic aspect of it, the excitement of it. That's what caught my ear right away. Later on, I learned to appreciate the fact that there is melody going on within all of that, all of the notes that seem to be surrounding it. So to go from that just killed me. I thought that's the most amazing thing. And there was and this is not to denigrate it at all. To me, it did have kind of a mechanical sound, but I don't mean that in a negative way, like it's just all mechanical and soulless. I like the fact that it had this sort of an evenness, the way you would hear a machine working. You know, sort of a clockwork kind of a thing going on. There was like you could sense a rhythm within it, and a pulse, and all that. And then within that, you have such strong musicality. That blend fascinated me. Still does. 45 years later, I still am amazed at what the sound of a forward and a backward roll can do, and when you add melody notes. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Yes, I understand. I mean, I still just when my banjo's set up right and I'm just playing it around the house, I'm just playing on a forward roll on like on a G chord, and and my timing's feeling good that day. You can just really get hypnotized by that that what you said, it's mechanical but not soulless. Like it has this it's this weird thing that works with the Scruggs style banjo.
It does, and I think it's something that does appeal to a certain, I don't know, maybe a certain personality or whatever. I find that it's interesting when you look at some of the people who are drawn to the banjo, like Bill Keith. He has a very analytical mind. And I've run into some other players like that. They're very good with machines or taking engines apart or working on watches or something. They're just like that kind of mind that's drawn to mechanics and the way gears and cogs and things work together. I remember before I ever got into music, I was always fascinated as a little kid to watch how things were made, or the way machinery in a factory would work with all kinds of conveyor belts and cogs and parts all working, and you could even hear kind of a clicking rhythm going on within that, sort of a pulse happening, but all this complexity around it. So it seemed like here was a musical format that actually had those elements in it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, you might be onto something. I mean, I know Greg Deering's very into machines himself. He's very good at that, and so it might.
Well, that's been brought up at the textile mills of North Carolina. Earl Scruggs had worked in one, and other banjo players had too. And maybe it was a documentary years ago about that, and sort of touched on that aspect a little bit. That possibly one thing besides the music, they're raised with the music, hearing the songs and all of that, but something about that style of three-finger picking that was popular in the Carolinas, coming from, to some extent, you're influenced by your environment. And if you're in a working or whatever environment where you're hearing that kind of thing all the time, that might be something that's sort of like deep down in your DNA, in your bones. Something, whether you know it or not, it's sort of subconsciously or subconsciously you're absorbing that.
You also mentioned, how there is melody coming out of these rolls, and I think with students, I know sometimes it's hard to kind of to get them to get that melody outside of the rolls, where it doesn't just sound like banjo, but it sounds like a song.
Right.
Is there any tips for our viewers to try to get pull melody out of when you're playing a basic Scruggs style roll?
Yeah, that's a great point, because when I was learning, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on that. I'm talking about mid 70s. It seemed like the way to learn, you got good books, Scruggs' book among others. Of course, that's an essential book for this style. But you would learn patterns, and then you'd learn how to apply those patterns to a tune, Cripple Creek in that case, and then you build on that. And then it seemed to be a matter of, listening to breaks, listening to specific tunes, how to apply those patterns, and then learn sort of how to play something note for note. That gets you going for sure, but it's not really teaching you how to extract the melody necessarily. I kind of arrived at that later, and I think a lot of people arrived at it about the same time. If you just strip it down to the bare bones, take a tune like Fireball Mail I was just playing a little while ago, and just, instead of playing the rolls, just do the most basic melody of the tune. And we don't have to go through the whole tune, but if you just add just a simple roll around that, or even just doing it in That's not even rolls, but now I'm getting sort of maybe some quarter notes going on, but possibly adding a roll. That might be an even better way to do it. It's just to have the whole notes of the basic melody and then hearing a forward roll that's filling the space rather than just empty space. That's sort of like one thing to do is just take whatever tune you're learning, a vocal tune of some kind, and extract it and break it down to the most basic melody, and then apply just basic open string rolls at first. If you're already playing bluegrass technique, then you can start adding hammers and pulls and slides and whatever you want to do just to embellish that. Anyway, I think that's that kind of thing. That would be basically the step. And a lot of people are teaching that more and more these days. I see more and more methods that are coming out that really emphasize this, because it seemed to be overlooked in some of the earlier banjo books. And that's, again, not to denigrate the early stuff, because that came along when there was really nothing else around, and it was valuable and incredible information to have. But this idea of getting a melody, if somebody has been playing for a number of years and they go to a jam session, they hear a tune that they're not familiar with, it's like, how do you play that? Well, you could go home and learn the break off of an album, or you could try to really work your ear to get the basic melody, add a few open rolls, and then add a little bit of bluegrass technique around it. And I mean, you could go on, you can do a 2-hour lesson just on that.
Definitely.
But it is so important. It's so great for your ear to do that, because I couldn't do that. I can tell you the first 5 years of playing, I couldn't do that. I wasn't even thinking like that. If someone said down the road, if I hadn't learned a tune like down the road, I went and learned it out of the Scruggs book, which is great. There it is. There's the tab, or maybe a tab from somewhere else. Now I know how to play down the road. But it didn't occur to me to analyze it and go, well, why is that? What's making that work, and why is that? It's like, well, just do it. Learn the tune.
Yeah.
Now you know how to play down the road without really thinking about what it took to arrive at that. So, by breaking it down, going back the other way, and sort of extracting the melody out, you learn to sort of analyze and see what makes that work.
Yeah.
Really critical, especially in that style.
Yeah, and it opens up your ears by starting to listen for melody and learn melody.
Yeah.
So you play some pretty progressive styles. You do of bluegrass banjo, but you still balance the line of very traditional. You're very good at pushing it, but also not making it weird or anything, like staying in the pocket. But how did you have teachers that brought you into these more modern styles, or were you just listening to players, certain players that were playing in this more sort of progressive bluegrass style? And if so, who were you listening to? Like, who kind of pushed you into this place where you are now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly not pushed. It's like as things came along. It so happens I got into this in '73. That's when I first got a banjo, took lessons. And I was really after Foggy Mountain Breakdown and tunes like that eventually, but really after Foggy Mountain Breakdown and the Foggy Mountain Banjo album, that's what I was after. That's the sound. I was not aware of melodic banjo at all. I didn't have any records that had that. I had Flat and Scruggs records wherever I could find them. There weren't that many in print at that time, in the mid-'70s. Actually, a lot of the classics weren't in print. Anyway, that's what I was really working on, Train 45, and hearing Bill Emerson playing Theme Time and things like that. Just loved it. And the Jimmy Martin Good and Country album, and all of that, loved it. So it was just by happenstance starting to tune into radio stations in the Baltimore, Washington area that were playing some of the more progressive stuff at the time, Seldom Seen in particular. And I remember hearing Ryder. I didn't know what it was, didn't know who the Seldom Seen was. Suddenly here's this tune and here's this banjo playing that was very different. Ben Eldridge doing incredible stuff on Ryder. I didn't know anything about the style, but I knew it was very, very different. So that caught my ear, but I didn't know how to approach it at all. But the first thing that really caught me was getting a dueling banjos album by Arthur Smith. And it turns out that Bobby Thompson was playing some 5-string banjo, and Arthur Smith was playing tenor banjo. But I got it because it's dueling banjos, and had a picture of a banjo on the front, and looked at the back, and it was Foggy Mountain Breakdown. Okay, good. This is stuff that seems familiar to me. Well, I wasn't as drawn to the tenor banjo, but on the dueling banjos cut on this album, Bobby Thompson takes this break on dueling banjos. Is that
Right.
Good Lord? And then the thing that caught me right away, and I couldn't figure any of that out. I didn't even know where it was, but as soon as he played that very straight first break, and then this, I was just as riveted as the first time I heard. I mean, as soon as I heard that, I didn't know where it was. I had no idea on the neck. I hadn't played anything like that, but it nailed me also. Just like Foggy Mountain. I heard that, and that got me into this. I didn't even know it was melodic style. Just so happens I started getting banjo newsletter around that time, and Mitchie was writing articles and mentioning melodic style banjo, and sometimes he would write a little passage of something in there, and it would be not that particular break, but sometimes a lick based off of something like that. So I sought out a little more Bobby Thompson and started hearing that kind of thing. And it's like, that was great. That's what I wanted to do also.
Yeah.
So while I'm learning the Scruggs thing, I was hearing that, and then hearing more and more players. Ben Eldridge was seldom seen. Alan Mundy, Country Gazette. I hadn't heard Courtney Johnson yet with Newgrass Revival. Didn't have that album, but not long after I started hearing this stuff, I finally got that album, heard Lonesome Fiddle Blues, and started hearing minor, D minor, ascending and descending licks and scales, and that's how I got really heavily into the melodic side of it.
So it's all mostly self-taught?
To some extent, yeah. I wasn't with it. Well, there was another instructor. The guy who got me started on banjo, he went another way and was eventually not as involved in music, but he put me onto his instructor, another real good banjo player in the Baltimore area, Arnold Sell. And I started taking lessons from him, and he started showing me some of this. I was figuring out some of it from Banjo Newsletter, but he was already able to play some of those kind of lines, and I was able to see on the neck where these notes were. So I was getting some lessons from him, but not a lot. It was, again, certain things happened. That melodic banjo book came out just at the right time. I remember seeing an article about Trishka, and they talked about how this book was going to be coming out in the next month or two, and it was like waiting on Christmas. It's just like I couldn't wait for this book to come out, melodic banjo, because I was really trying to get it, but it was in bits and pieces in Banjo Newsletter. But here was going to be a book that to me was like the Scruggs book of melodic banjo, of melodic style, was this melodic banjo book. So I worked a lot of that book.
And today, do you improvise in the melodic style, or do you work out most of your melodic breaks beforehand?
I'd say probably a good bit of it is worked out. Within that, I do interchange bits and pieces. And in fact, I think of the melodic style, even though it's a different technique, but my approach to it is very much like Scruggs style. If you take Scruggs style and you can break it down to these licks and phrases, and then you can mix and match them. That's all just interchangeable Scruggs style licks that can be worked into solos and all that. So you can do the same thing with a melodic phrase. So. So you take little bits and pieces of, say in that case, I'm just working sort of some blues scale, but they are separate phrases, but by doing them for years and years, I've learned to be able to sort of mix and match within that, so it can give kind of this. There's some improv going on. I can change direction in those kind of things and move around in them pretty freely now. I couldn't do that at first. I had to learn them first, learn the scales, learn where they lay out. But I would say that's how I improvise. I improvise in those sort of chunks of 1, 2, or 3 measure lines. Is that making sense?
And did you, yeah, totally. And did you learn like, licks, melodic licks that worked over certain chord, certain harmony, or
Yeah.
so you kind of had your kind of, your 10 like G licks and your 10 D licks, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yes,
did you
I
just
did
memorize those, or did you write them down or something? I remember
I would write
writing
them
these
too.
down and making like a notebook of them, this stuff.
Oh my gosh, yes. I did the same thing. If I came across something, I was like, I'm never going to remember that. I would scribble it out. I mean, sometimes if I was elsewhere, just write 5 lines and write the numbers. But yeah, I had notebooks of things like that, like something that maybe I stumbled on or had just learned. I was like, oh gosh, I love this phrase. I really, I don't want to forget it. Yes, I would. At the time, I wasn't even taping anything yet, so I would write that down. And yeah, I was thinking of it very much like, okay, this is something that works over G. Here's something that's a D lick or a C lick. So it was very, I hadn't really gotten the hang of music in the way of understanding that these things can flow in different ways and they're not necessarily locked into just G, C, and D licks. But I tended to think of it that way early on, for sure.
And how'd you make that leap over where you weren't just playing like this puzzle piece that went on top of the G chord, and then you stopped playing and played this other puzzle piece that went on top of this D chord or something? How'd you make that? Do you remember how, or recommendations on how to get to that transition place? Because I remember being in that spot too, where I had these licks and I put them on this certain type of harmony, but the musicality wasn't quite there because they were kind of like, all right, here's this thing and here's this thing.
Yeah.
But how to connect it all together where sounds like, a musical idea.
Great question. That's so important because, yeah, I had no feel for that whatsoever. What was helpful for me was listening to really great fiddle players. We had a couple of excellent fiddle players in the Baltimore area back in that day, late 70s. Warren Blair, John Glick, 2 incredible fiddle players still around and wonderful players. Anyway, I got the chance to start to play with guys like this, and I really couldn't comprehend it. I was learning fiddle tunes, and I would learn my one break to a specific fiddle tune. But the more I was playing with really fine fiddlers like that, I realized, oh my gosh, they're not thinking, at least to me, and I didn't ask them this, I was just from playing with them, I realized that's not what they're doing at all. I didn't sense that they're playing G licks and C licks and D licks. There was just so much beautiful flow from one thing to another, and a lot of it made no sense to me right away. I was like, wait a minute, that's a G thing. Why is that working? It didn't even occur to me to ask that right away, but I'd be like, why is that working so well over C? Or how come that thing is working beautifully over D? I thought you had to go to a D lick. I mean, that's really how basic my understanding was. And being around that influence really rubbed off because I love fiddle tunes. I really tried to play the fiddle too. I really worked on it, but couldn't really get that going as much. But I love fiddle music, love fiddle tunes, and besides fiddle tunes, I love fiddle phrasing. I love fiddle breaks, Chubby Wise, everything from the early Chubby Wise fiddle breaks with Monroe, Can't You Hear Me Calling, that kind of thing, to everything that's going on today, to all the stuff that Vassar has done. And when I listen to great fiddlers, I'm really tuning into the way they flow. And nowadays, really, that's very common, to some extent very common. You hear that more. I mean, they're great mandolin players. You listen to other instruments and the way they flow with their ideas. And it's not just the fiddle, but the fiddle was a big part of what I had my ear tuned into. But then I started really listening and seeing mandolin players are doing that, guitar players are doing that too, and now everybody's doing it. And starting to listen to some other forms of music. And I'm not a jazz player really at all, but I would hear it and listen to certain things. I always loved Oscar Peterson, even though I'm not a pianist at all, but I do love his music. And just hearing that kind of flow and phrasing and realizing that, okay, there's more to it than just breaking it down to specific licks in certain keys or over certain chords. And I think that's really, I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's really how I started hearing that.
Did you start transcribing other instruments, or did you just start to just listen deeper on what other instruments were doing?
Listening deeper, or I would hear a phrase and think, gosh, that's really a great phrase. Why is that working? What is it about that? Or the way these fiddle would play when they're improvising, not just playing a fiddle tune, but they're playing a break on some given tune. And I'm thinking, gosh, how are they able to make that flow? And it just seemed like it was an endless flow of ideas. And obviously on a violin, on a fiddle, it's melodic ideas. It's just like constant. And it just seems like they're not even thinking in terms of licks. I mean, you do hear a lick, or you'll hear a phrase, sure, that'll jump out once in a while, but you're hearing an altogether different flow of music. And I would try to copy that, sure. I would sometimes, if somebody like that, a great fiddler, would take a really interesting break on something, I would work it out, or I'd work out as much of it as I possibly could and see where is it going, and why is it going there, and why is that connecting in a certain way. And it really did help break the habit of what I had in turn sort of learned by learning just specific patterns over certain chords. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that's just the way I learned the banjo, was the Scruggs style and learning these sort of chunks of music and putting together different ways. But it took me a while to sort of break from that, but I have to say I still kind of think of it that way.
Yeah.
It still shows up.
Yeah,
If you hear enough of me, you'll hear some familiar phrases. I have some pet licks and phrases. It's not unusual,
No, I think everybody does to a certain extent.
Yeah.
It's part of the vocabulary you have.
Yeah.
Do you want to play another tune for us?
Sure. Well, I'll play you one of mine. This is a tune called M80, and I recorded this with Frank Solivan, Dirty Kitchen, a number of years back. On the Edge album.
Wow. That's fantastic. That's a fantastic tune. It's incredible
I
playing.
appreciate that. It's hearing the chords under it would be helpful. I know that can sound a little scattered when you're hearing it sort of on its own like that. But well, I'm glad you like it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good.
And
And you
those are the
said
kind
you,
of licks and phrases I do favor a lot too.
yeah, they're hip, they're good. You mentioned you played it with Frank Sullivan, and you're currently playing with Frank Sullivan in Dirty Kitchen. How, d-
Yeah.
when did you start in that band, and what are some of your favorite things about playing in that band?
Started actually, I think officially we started in March of 2009. So we've been going at it for a while. And what I love is Frank writes great material, and he's a fantastic musician. No question about that. And it's always been a strong band in terms of rhythm. The singing is strong, and the material is interesting, and a lot of original material. And I'd say the choice of material, the way it's presented, it, it's I enjoy it for me because it gives me plenty of variety to play around with, and it's challenging for me to create breaks on somebody else's original tunes that don't always necessarily follow the traditional patterns. Sometimes they do, but sometimes there are other things. There's a wide range of dynamics in our music, and all of that really appeals to me.
Yeah, it's a fantastic band. Obviously, y'all have been nominated for a Grammy Award. And I was listening a fair amount to that last album that came out in 2019. Um,
Right.
are y'all working on anything right now? Recording anything?
Yeah, we just recorded a new project just a couple of weeks ago, and so vocals are being added to it now, and it's, again, some of Frank's originals are on there, and it's going to be a really nice project for sure. Probably out
That's
sometime. I think we're like late spring. I think we're shooting for maybe April or May.
awesome. Awesome. Keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, keep an ear out for it.
Yeah, keep an ear out for it. Yeah, exactly. Well, you're besides being one of the top, bluegrass banjoists on the scene today, you're also a fantastic banjo setup technician. Um, how did you learn some? Because there's many players that don't know too much about actually setting up their instrument. How did you get into that? And and then yeah, start there.
Well, fortunately, right out of high school, I got to work in a music store that just opened up in Baltimore called Baltimore Bluegrass. So here we had a bluegrass music store right in town. I started working there, just learning, just how to work in a store. But I knew nothing about setting up myself, nothing at all. I hadn't changed. I think I'd barely changed the strings on my own instrument, much less anything else. So it was learning how to set up shop inventory. Uh, we were learning too, so there weren't really, any books or seminars, much information like that. The owner of the store, Steve Cunningham, he was learning a good bit about repair. He was really seeking it out, and he was starting to do some pretty deep repair work on fiddles and mostly guitars, and really became an excellent repairman. But I wasn't really involved in that right away. It was mostly just setting up shop inventory, and he would show me a few things about how to, tighten a banjo head, or get the action down, or something like that on basic, um, beginner level, entry level instruments. So that was really a lot of it right away, and I really was learning on my own instrument at the same time. I just finally got around to changing the head, and it took me all afternoon, because I wanted to be really careful. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get it back together again, and all that kind of thing, just going very slowly. So it was a little bit at a time, reading articles in places like Banjo Newsletter. There really weren't any books yet. That sort of came out years later. There were a few books that came along on setup. So it was a lot of trial and error. But I think learning how to set up that inventory and make minor adjustments on better quality instruments, and as I got better with that and more confident with it, I started being able to do a little more detailed work on mid-level to higher level instruments. But it was a lot of experimenting on my own. I wasn't deep into building or anything like that. I wasn't making necks or any of that kind of thing. But it was really just how to adjust the instrument, how to get the sound that I was hearing on albums, but I didn't feel like I was getting it myself, and I was, of course, still trying to play too. So, how much is it me that's not getting the sound, or how much is it the instrument, or the bridge, or the head, and all that? So it's the stuff that we all go through of trying to figure out what is it that's making it right. Now you have a lot of information available on the Hangout and various other sources where people who've been doing it for a long time are offering a lot of really great advice on how to achieve this. But a lot of it's going to come from your ear. I mean, you can learn how to make the adjustments and learn the nuts and bolts of things to look for, but so much of it comes down to what are you hearing and what are you looking for?
Right, because then there's so many different takes on, how the tailpiece should be set on the tension hoop, or or what's the best head tension, or just various things like that. But it really does matter what you're looking for.
Yeah,
but what are some of the
I just want to finish up with that point, not to interrupt you, but I just
Yeah.
hang on to the question you're thinking of right there, because that is so vital, and it took me a long time to do this, and I think for some people more or less amount of time, of really getting that sense of tone in your mind. And it can change over the years. What you may have loved 20 or 30 years ago might be a little different now. Your taste may have changed and all that, but really getting a solid sense of what you're really looking for is so important, because otherwise you're kind of flying blind, flying deaf to some extent. You're just kind of chasing things, or you're taking advice from wherever, and it may be perfectly good advice, but unless you can really hear it and hear those differences, that takes a certain amount of time of getting a discerning ear for what you're really looking for. So, in terms of doing setup, you can get things kind of a neutral setup that just basically works, but really dialing in setup for a specific player or for yourself takes a little bit more time, and certainly you have to have your ear really sort of developed to a certain level to get results that you're looking for. That's all. I just wanted to throw that in, because it's so,
and when
that
you
aspect gets
definitely
overlooked.
right, because there's not one specific thing. It's not like this is what you do to make it sound the best.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes in, it's like an artist comes in, and do you kind of have a conversation about what they're going for when you try to set up their instrument,
Yeah.
tonal wise?
If it's an artist, someone who's really playing, they know what they're looking for.
Yeah.
They're not usually looking for how do I get this sound out of my instrument. They already know from playing and all that. They're usually in a situation where they just need a good fret job. Maybe it's just frets are buzzing, or there could be something going on with the instrument. Maybe the tone is changing a little bit too drastically from day to day or week to week, and you don't want to know what's going on. And that gets just more into technical issues about the construction of the instrument, or is it set up properly. If it's somebody who's not necessarily artist level, but a good player, but they're still dealing with those issues of, gosh, why is it not sound so good here? Or how come when I play an A, it's not very good, or it's, it could be most basic things, like it's just the bridge is in the wrong place, so tuning is not good. Or if they just seem to be, they just want it to sound better, but then frankly it can come down to their technique too. They haven't really arrived yet at the space where they can play consistently enough so that they know there's something going on with the instrument and not just something going on with their hands. That's really a tricky deal right there. Just backpedaling on that just for a second, I will have that conversation with somebody. If it's somebody I don't know what they're looking for, first thing I ask, who are you listening to? Who are your favorite players? And then I'll just sort of do a basic kind of a look at it, like, well, a neutral setup of a Scruggs Crow sound somewhere in here, and any number of players that are going to get that kind of sound. If you're looking for a darker, fuller Bela Noam kind of a sound, that's another matter altogether. That would be a specific setup. If you're looking for something with a bit more crack and high end, and think of it as like a Ralph Stanley archtop sound, that would be sort of the extreme up here. So just sort of try to get some kind of a gauge on what they favor in that realm. And then we can even dial it into specific players, like, or even with a player and say, okay, JD Crow, all right, great. Yeah, I love JD too. Which album? Because they're all different. They're all great, but they're all different. And that's been discussed about Earl Scruggs too. The Mercury session sounds very different from Carnegie Hall, sounds really different from a lot of the mid-50s Columbia recordings. Almost any one of those, for different reasons. Calfskin head versus plastic, different mics, different studio, different everything. Different necks on his Granada. So, you know, within them, you can get someone who says, yeah, I really like, you know, it could be just anything that Earl Scruggs did. Okay, well, we can get you pretty close to a setup on that. Or it's, yeah, I really like this album. Or this cut on this album. They can get really specific. So, yeah, we'll have that conversation. I think it's important to do that and try to hear it. And sometimes I've even asked someone to come in, bring a recording. Bring along something you think is just killer, like the ultimate in tone. Like, here it is, this cut right here, that sound, that's what I'm looking for.
That's
that
awesome.
Helps a lot.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely. I've had those conversations when recording, when trying to capture, you know, I like this record, you know, can we try to, I've never had it in a you know, in a setup situation.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's vital to do that. And you can really, for anybody out there that maybe they don't have access to somebody who sets up an instrument or a banjo specifically, and you're going to make an appointment with somebody who does that, think about those things ahead of time. It could really help if you really dial that in, rather than just have a blanket, well, I just want it to sound fuller, or
Right.
I just, you know, I like a deep sound or a rich sound. I mean, that's all, you know, can be one man's ears, you know, it can be hard to sort of dial that in. But if you say, I like this recording, and even get right down to what is it about that recording or that cut. And it could even be right down to one lick in a song where you just have a banjo lick that really sticks out, and you go, man, that sound right there that's like exactly the kind of tone I'm looking for. They
Right.
can really, you can probably get some better results from your setup tech if you can really give them that information ahead of time.
Yeah.
And have them.
Well, we have some.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and play for that person too, because you know that's also one thing I would do. Not just put the banjo up on the bench and just start working on it. It's like,
Right.
you know, someone says, I just don't like the sound of my banjo. Let me hear you play.
Right.
And that's
Because
not
each
to
player
get
brings
suddenly
out.
criticize their playing or anything like that. But if they're saying, geez, my banjo sounds really bright, but it turns out it could be more of a technical issue with, you know, the right hand. So, you know, that gets into a kind of a possibly a sensitive area.
Definitely.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. I get so excited about
No,
this stuff,
but
I can yak forever.
No, I love it. But we have a number of questions coming in on the chat about some setup things. I'd like to get to these.
Sure.
There's one from Larry. It says, thanks so much. Let's see. During Avi's sessions, I'd like to ask your opinion concerning truss rod adjustment and tone. We know the neck relief can be set differently for each banjo and player's desires, but I've seemed to notice that on my main banjo, one you played for an hour or so at Jack Hatfield's house about 3 years ago, that occasionally the tone is just a tiny bit less than I want. I'm not a parts changer and don't make quick adjustments, but I've found that consistently a very slight backing off and resetting the tension on the rod brings back what I'm looking for in tone. I never adjusted enough to change neck relief, but just kind of retension the rod. This may only come up 2 to 3 times per year. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and boy, that's a loaded question too, because we can talk for 3 hours on that. Yeah, there's definitely something to the tension on the neck, and I'm glad he brought up the point of I'm not trying to change the relief, because I would say no matter what, you want that relief to be accurate. And because it's so important that it's proper. If there's too much relief, you run into intonation problems. Too little relief, you start running into possible buzzing issues and action problems. So the action and relief do need to be within a certain realm of correctness. But sure enough, the tension on the rod does affect things, because if you tighten that a little bit, you stiffen the neck a little bit, and it can change. And I can't always say exactly which way it works, because sometimes you put a little more tension on and it seems to give you like more vibe in the neck, like you can really feel the neck sort of move more. And if you back off the truss rod a little bit, it seems like that goes away, and now it feels a little bit soft or not as responsive. And sometimes it works the other way. If the truss rod is a little tight, it can feel like, well, the neck feels okay, you loosen it just a hair, and suddenly now it seems more responsive. So I've encountered that going both ways. But I have to say that yes, it does affect the tone. I think it affects feel almost more than tone, and I do make a distinction on that. That it's not always going to be a sonic difference that you're going to hear right away and go, wow, I hear that. That's much deeper now that I've backed off the truss rod or whatever, but more of a feel in the neck and a responsiveness of the overall instrument, going from either stiff to responsive.
Yeah, I've run across that. Definitely. I ran across that one time setting up my archtop guitar. I brought to a very good luthier, and he just tweaked the truss rod, and it opened up the whole guitar.
Yeah.
It was like the tension of thinking it like a banjo, it's like the tension of the top now was changed, and because you can't change the tension of the top of guitar, so it seemed to like just open it up. And then I've noticed that on banjo, by just touching it, you can sometimes find this little thing that it, not always, but sometimes it responds more.
Yeah, it's tricky, because it could be from the day one. Now we're talking about a piece of wood that varies from not only whether you have the mahogany or maple or anything like that, but you could have 10 mahogany necks practically cut from the same tree, and they're still maybe going to respond a little bit differently. Maybe I don't do building of the instrument, so I don't know about how to install a truss rod properly, but depending on how a truss rod was installed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it has something to do with how deep the channel is or whatever, but there's something that maybe could affect that and make that truss rod act differently with that piece of wood. It's the unpredictable nature of wood and, of course, construction that can more or less make some kind of a difference there. So there is something to that.
Is that some of the fun of setting up instruments too? Is that there is no exact thing where you just set it to, because each instrument is different subtly. Each piece of wood is slightly different, so you do have to use your ear. You can't just say, okay, this is this model, and I'm going to turn the wrench to point A, or
Right. That's an interesting question. I think it's sort of a blessing and a curse all at once. Because it does make things interesting and challenging. On the other hand, it can make it extremely aggravating, because then you feel like, gosh, you don't really have any constants to work with. It's like, all the rules are changing, right under your hands. I liked it. It took me a long time to arrive at an overall neutral setup that worked well for me. And that's, the bridge and head tension, tailpiece tension, and all that kind of thing. I knew nothing about that. First 10 or 15 years of playing, I would mess around with it, but I didn't really understand totally what those things were doing. It wasn't until I got around other people that knew this stuff that there was more discussion about head tension. As far as I know, nobody hardly talked about that in the 70s and 80s. It was just tighten it up till it breaks and back it off. That was the old line. but you didn't have all these different bridges and all this. Nobody was talking about how much tailpiece gap to have or any of that. So I think what makes the banjo interesting for me is there are certain things that you can do that can really, if you apply certain principles right away, or certain steps right away to an instrument that's not set up properly. There's a certain order to things to get it into a good neutral setup, and then it's a matter of dialing that in. And yeah, I would say I do enjoy the challenge of it. I also enjoy the fact that there are certain things that are certain rules that do seem to work universally. So you need a certain amount of head tension to get a certain response, and certainly the quality of the components and how they're put together. Those rules have changed somewhat over the years. It's not as much about everything being tight and squeezed together. It's more of a loose setup for some people now. But to answer that question, yeah, it's still a challenge. I would think working on only wood instruments like violins, mandolins, guitars would be really so much more challenging, because you don't have the mechanical nature of just quickly making an adjustment with a tailpiece, or throw another bridge on. Well, you can do that with a mandolin and a fiddle, but it's not as easy to make some of those changes, and it could be something about deeper into the material of the wood or whatever that really changes that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I expressed that too well, but I think you know what I mean. With the banjo, you can make, within 15 or 20 minutes, really drastic improvements on a bad setup.
Yeah.
I could do that in almost no time. If the components are decent, within a reasonable amount of time, without even changing very much, you can make a handful of adjustments that are known adjustments that'll bring it from here to here right away.
Right.
So I enjoy that aspect of it on the banjo in particular.
We have another question from the chat. It's from Joseph Brosk. He says, when my banjo is tuned, allegedly, I fret the string for the next whole setup. Should that next note ring true, or should it be a bit sharp? Example, third string is in tune, but when I fret it at the second fret for an A, the A is quite sharp. Is this normal, or do I have a bridge placement issue?
It could be bridge placement. So that's the first thing you want to check. Well, we all check of the 12th fret, harmonic, and fretted note. Also, the 19th fret is a good place to check for that, and sometimes comes in a little more accurately. Learned that from Tom Neckville. He pointed that out. I think he had that in one of his books. We were just discussing that, but sometimes you can even dial in bridge placement a little more accurately at the 19th fret, but the 12th fret is a good place to start. If that's working, but you're still getting a sharp A going on there, that could be that the nut action is too high. So if the nut action right here off of the first fret is too high, then you're possibly stretching that string down to the fingerboard. You're actually pushing and stretching the string down too far. A lot of this information is out there. One really quick little rule of thumb, or finger in this case, you can press the third string at the third fret. In this case, you're working with your third string. And then look at the first fret, the gap between, I'm holding them, trying to get this camera right there. You're not going to see this gap, but if I press the third string, third fret, I want to see a little bit of motion off the top of the first fret with that third string. I mean, a little bit of movement. And what's a little bit of movement? Well, I can't really show you on here, but there are people who are measuring this thing out. I mean, maybe 5,000ths or something like that. But some kind of movement there, but not too much. If you have a good deal of movement where you're really stretching it at the first fret, you're going to have some serious intonation problems going on right here in the first position. Also, how hard you're fretting, and that's a whole other issue. And again, we can talk about that for hours. But whether you're capoing or fretting, are you making sure that when you're fretting, you're right at the fret, not on top of the fret, but not back here either. You don't want to be back behind the fret, because you want to let the fret really do the work. If I'm back behind the fret, here's the same, just to give you an idea. We're going off of this a little bit. We've talked about bridge placement, possibly nut action too high. Basically, what the technique I've tried to work on for years is to develop a fairly light touch with the left hand, to the point where I'm not really touching the fingerboard. I can feel it a little bit, but I'm not really making much contact there. Here I am fretting at the second fret, a nice clear, clean note. Here's the same tension. I'm not pressing any harder. I'm hardly bending that string. I'm just moving my finger up. I'm not pressing harder to get a clean note out of that. That's just the string on the fret with hardly any deflection of that string bent behind the fret. That gets, again, into capoing issues as well. I see that a lot. I used to do that a lot. I used to really gouge out a fingerboard, or I'd be holding a D chord or something and my fingers would be splayed out like this, and maybe my little finger wasn't all the way up to the 4th fret. It might have been back here. So what do? It's buzzing. You press harder, and now it goes sharp.
Yeah.
So you have to really watch your left hand technique and pressure. Quick review: bridge placement, nut action, and then left hand pressure. And now another issue, possibly a high or low fret, or something going on with the frets.
Right. Great tips. We have another question. We have a question from Lynn. She says, any thoughts on having a radius versus a flat neck? Deering has recently come out with the radius neck models. Any advantage to changing a standard Deering, for example, Sierra neck to a radius neck?
Yeah, I think the radius neck is really comfortable for certain playing styles. I tried one myself. I remember when Bela got that radius Monteleone neck back in the 70s, and well, not 70s, rather 80s, I think early 80s, and started seeing him playing with this Newgrass and doing that. And of course, I love his playing, always have and still do and always will. So I thought, geez, that might be the way to go, if I want to get that sound and, go after that. There must be something to the radius neck. Tried one for a while, certainly nothing wrong with it, but I soon discovered that for my playing style, it was not necessary. And the reason I just felt that way for me was noticing the way he played over the years and the techniques he's developed require much more barring on the neck. If you're holding a position and working around it, something like that, I think that's, what song was that? Is that Metric Lips? No, it's not. I can't remember which tune it was, but anyway, sort of a Bela-esque type of lick there. That's really comfortable to have a radius. That feels really good. If you're barring a lot or holding, these kind of shaped chords where you're barring a couple of partial strings, or that kind of thing, definitely a lot more comfortable on a radius board. But if you're playing standard Scruggs style or melodic style, the kind of thing I'm doing, I found that there was no advantage to having the radius board. If you're doing single string, if you're a heavy single string player, I think the radius board would be helpful, because it's the same thing comes into play, because the single string is not simply just notes like that. A lot of times there are little bar positions that are done with the middle finger or ring finger, and again, that same kind of comfort in the left hand when you're holding a bar position, working the other fingers, or doing very quick little 2 or 3 note bars, that's where the radius really comes into play. But to play for my ear, or not for my ear, but for my playing, I don't find that would be any advantage on a radius board if you're predominantly playing that style or a melodic. That wouldn't be any easier with a radius board. So it really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing a lot more jazzy chords, bar chords, and single string, radius would be helpful.
Nice.
Sorry, another long-winded answer.
No, not at all. I mean, we could go on and on. I'd love to keep chatting with you. We do need to start to wrap it up. We have one more quick question from the chat. Tracy Griffith. She says, I have a bear claw tailpiece that I bought the banjo from, only uses ball end strings. I was wondering if I could use loop end strings.
I think you can. I haven't seen one of those in a while, but I know what you mean. The bear claw has, like, for each string, kind of like almost like 2 prongs that come together, and you slide that ball in between them. You can open up the loop and get it around those 2 prongs. I don't really have anything to demonstrate that with. I'll sort of fake it with these scissors here. It's almost like right at at each string, you have these two pieces here, and then the ball end goes right in the middle. But if you open up that loop, you can get the loop to go around that. This is obviously much bigger, but that tapers it on the bear claws that I've seen like that can work, and that won't hurt the loop. When you do open up the loop, you can use an awl or a nail punch or something like that, and just sort of get more of a circle going into that loop instead of a little oval. So that it is possible to use loop strings on a bear claw.
Okay, thanks. It's been fantastic. I could keep going for hours and hours, both about playing technique and about banjo setup with you. I'd love to have you on again and dive deeper into either or of these. But would you mind? Thanks for being here. Gonna ask you to play one more tune. Before we go, everybody, next week we have John Bullard on the show, classical 5-string banjo player John Bullard. So definitely tune in next Thursday to see him. And Mike, thanks again. This was a lot of fun. Do you mind playing us out?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Let me ask you, I have like a kind of a Christmas medley I could do, like those kind of things, or do you want another breakdown kind of tune? What would you, what would be your preference on something like that?
A Christmas medley. It's a little early in the season for me for
It's
Christmas tunes.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, it kind of is.
But if you want to kick off the holiday season, I guess you could. But
all right, I'll do a little bit of an abbreviated little holiday thing. And also, I want to send out, a heartfelt salute to our troops and all the veterans today. Absolutely, on Veterans Day, so important. Definitely. And thank you all, everybody, one and all, for your service.